Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, a place to find connection, a sense of belonging, and community, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young, licensed clinical social worker. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. This is a weekly podcast where we explore how sensitivity weaves itself into our lives. We talk about the richness that it adds, the strengths we have because of our sensitivity, and some of the challenges it poses as well. Sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Hey there. To the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers. This is episode 17, part 1. My guest is Dara Hoffman-Fox, who is non-binary. If you've never heard the term, we'll discuss it in this episode. But Dara's pronouns are they and them, as well as using Dara in place of a pronoun. I'm telling you this now so you'll understand why it may sound unusual when I refer to Dara. I don't write out my introductions, but I did for these 2 episodes with Dara because learning to use language in a new way can be really challenging. And it was important for me to respect Dara and refer to them in a way that honors who they are. Because the interview went long, you'll hear part 1 of our interview today, and then on Thursday I'll release part 2 of this episode. After we recorded the interview, I had some questions about the use of pronouns and reached out to Dara, and we decided to record an addendum, which you'll hear at the end of part 2. Interestingly, in this episode, I talk about another podcast interview that Dara did, and the host used female pronouns in the introduction to the episode, which is why I'm writing this out. And Dara and I talk about this. Dara points out that I use gender-neutral pronouns when talking about the podcast host because I wanted to be respectful and provide the host anonymity. I had no idea that I had done that in the moment. Our use of language just fascinates me. In this first episode, Dara defines what it means to be non-binary as well as transgender. Dara talks about what it means when someone goes through, I'm using air quotes here, wrong, puberty, which is one of the more challenging aspects of being transgender. We also talk about the distinction between gender identity and sexual orientation, which are unrelated to each other. I had a big aha moment while we were recording. I'm a little embarrassed to admit this. I was really focusing primarily on parts, genitalia, in terms of gender identity, when it occurred to me, well, Dara pointed this out, that it's about so much more than genitalia. I don't feel I can adequately explain this, but my identity as a woman is so much more than my parts. I don't feel like a guy. I don't identify with the stereotypical things that are related to guys. It goes way beyond parts. I also talk about my curiosity, and when I was listening back to the interview to edit it, I got a little concerned that it sounds like I'm wanting to be voyeuristic in kind of a creepy, lurking way. I use the practice of mindfulness personally in my practice and with my clients. To me, curiosity is about removing all judgment and all rules and just having an innocent sense of wonder and wanting to learn more. I don't want you guys to think I'm creepy. In one part of the interview, Dara states the specific name for male genitalia, and I beep it out. It's crazy, but in order to rate this podcast as clean, I can't swear, and we cannot use biologically correct names for body parts. The last 2 things I want to mention are that Dara talks about marginalized fatigue. Which highly sensitive people can experience as well when we need to stop and provide information about being a highly sensitive person, or asking to have our needs met, and we only have so much energy to get through the day. Dara has to take time to talk about pronouns or going to the DMV to get their gender marker changed. This is what marginalized fatigue is. If this is the first time you're listening to the podcast and you're not familiar with the term highly sensitive person or you don't know what it is, You don't have to be a highly sensitive person to listen to the podcast. If you go to hsperson.com, Dr. Elaine Aron is the one that coined the term highly sensitive person, and there's a self-test there. If you're a deep thinker and a deep feeler, you're in the right place. Finally, Dara and I talk about the power of modeling vulnerability to build connection, and as concerned as I get about saying everything right sometimes, it's easy to get overly focused on the person's gender, and we miss the opportunity to have the genuine connection with the person. Let me tell you a little bit about Dara. Dara Hoffman-Fox, LPC, is a queer-identified gender therapist in private practice in Colorado Springs, Colorado. As a subject matter expert on transgender and non-binary issues, Dara is the creator of Conversations with a Gender Therapist YouTube channel, as well as the author of the Amazon #1 bestseller, You and Your Gender Identity, A Guide to Discovery. Dara's goal is to get as much education, resources, and support out there as possible to the trans and gender questioning persons of the world. Through the magic of the internet, Dara is able to do this through their Conversations with a Gender Therapist YouTube channel and Facebook page, media and podcast interviews, and the content you'll find on their website found at darahoffmanfox.com. If you've been considering therapy and you're not sure that you're ready, I have a couple of thoughts. In bonus episode 32 called Do Therapists Have Therapists? I talk about misconceptions about therapy and my beliefs about what therapy is about. If you live in California and you're curious about telehealth, which means meeting on a platform similar to Skype, but this one's private, I offer a free 20-minute consultation. It can be really scary to reach out to ask about therapy if you haven't done it before, even if you have done it before. This is one of the reasons why I offer a free consultation. It gives you a chance to see how you feel talking to me. We can talk about your goals. I can see if I feel like I'm a good fit for you, if I can help you meet those goals. We can have a free online consultation for 20 minutes so that you can see for yourself what you think about meeting online. No obligation, no pressure. If you're interested, you can go to patriciayounglcsw.com to find out more about the work I do and to get in touch with me. And now, on to the show. Hey, Dara, welcome.
Thanks for having me on your show, Patricia.
I'm really excited about this conversation that we're going to have, so thank you so much for being here today.
I've really enjoyed listening to your show for the last, I discovered it a few weeks ago. And so to now be a guest on it is definitely a pleasure.
Oh, well, thanks. Do you identify as a highly sensitive person, Dara?
Yes, I definitely do. And I would say probably even more so after having listened to your podcast.
What's changed for you since you started listening to the podcast?
I would say I was first introduced to the book, actually the Highly Sensitive Person book, over 10 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago, by a good friend who said she was a highly sensitive person. And so I read it, and I remember at the time, I was like, oh my gosh, I think this might really be me as well. And then as things happen in life, sometimes we forget that we just learned something really interesting about ourselves and then just move on. So honestly, I think that that's what happened. And so I then have seen things pop up online over the years about it. And I think I just continued to not necessarily take it seriously. And so once I remember I did come across your podcast because I specifically was in my Stitcher app and I searched for highly sensitive person podcast because I had picked up a book at a conference. It was a conference related to working my line of work, which is working with transgender clients. But there was a big table of books from this publisher, and they had one about being a highly sensitive person, really like an instruction manual. And I was like, you know what? I might need to think about this again. And I just read it. I was like, oh my gosh, I really need to take this seriously this time. So when I got back from that trip, I decided I needed to really buckle down and learn more about it. So that's when your podcast came up.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't because we're in a number of the same online groups on Facebook. So I've been familiar with who you are. So when you reached out to Messenger, I was familiar with the work that you'd done. Were you aware of my presence on social media before you found the podcast?
Yeah, it's one of those things where my brain is not great at remembering names. I do good with seeing profile pictures, and then I start to maybe make an association between seeing the picture and the name pop up over and over again. So once I actually found your podcast, I was like, oh, I've heard of this before. So it was sort of fresh, but also at the same time, it's sort of like a dream that I sort of like forgot and then remembered later in the day.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Did you say that you learned you were an HSP about 10 years ago?
I remember that I had a strong suspicion that that was true. And so I would say I revisited the quiz after you put the link in your show notes in one of your episodes. And I think maybe there's 26 questions and I scored like 23. And so in this case, I actually feel like, especially as I grow older, I really have to, if I want to actually function in this world, I have to take care of myself as a highly sensitive person and prioritize that, or else I'm not going to be able to do fun things like travel and go to conferences, because I had a terrible time when I traveled to that conference. It was in Philadelphia and I'm in Colorado. And just a variety of things happened with my sleep and being uncomfortable in the room I was staying in. I realized I'm not going to be able to do everything I want to do in my career unless I start treating this as if this is a really like a high priority in terms of my health and my wellness. And so it's kind of like I wanted to then just integrate myself as much as possible into learning how can I better take care of myself as an HSP.
Yeah. And if you're listening and you're a highly sensitive person, there are all kinds of hacks that you can figure so that you can really live the life that you want. It may mean making some adjustments. One of my closest friends lives internationally and she travels to San Diego twice a year, and she's lived in different countries every couple of years. And I'm in awe at how adaptable she's become. And she also has special dietary needs. So it means she has to travel with food. And, it takes a good day or two to travel from one continent to another. So I just want to give hope that for those of you that if you feel like traveling or doing things is not a possibility because you feel rattled by change and all the things that go on with it, it really is a possibility. If it's something that you're not into, then don't worry about it. But yeah.
This sounds like a good future episode for you to find someone to interview, because I would be so interested in learning more about that. So yeah, everything when it comes down to, like you said, eating, and in terms of trying to adjust for time zones, and then what kind of space are you in and what do you need to bring into your sleeping space, and how can you take care of yourself during the day? Yeah, all of that I feel like I want to get into a really good system and a good groove with that. And then if I'm traveling with other people, that's another challenge, is then trying to get everybody to understand this is just how I'm going to have to function. And usually it turns out there's a couple other family members who are grateful for that, because it turns out they're also HSPs.
Sure. What do you think of the term highly sensitive person?
I've heard discussion on your podcast about this, and so I have been thinking about it. And I would say my first instinct is that I would agree with those who say that highly sensitive can be really misconstrued. A lot of times, I know that I gave the quiz after I took it, I like to make everybody else take it. And my partner was sort of thrown off by that. She scored low. And so she thought that meant that there was something wrong with her, that she's not sensitive in the sense of being emotionally sensitive. In her line of work, she's a dog trainer, but she shows a lot of sensitivity towards her clients. And so then my daughter took it and she's like, oh man, I'm not sensitive. So everybody who I gave it to who scored lower was like, oh no. So it's kind of funny because a lot of people, sometimes they say it's the opposite. Like, I'm not highly sensitive. Don't call me that. But in this case, I gave it to people who were kind of bummed out because of just, that's what the quiz is called.
Right.
And then I know you've talked on your show, you've had male guests come on and talk about that, the word sensitive, and how that can be challenging for them and can maybe put off some of people who are guys in terms of embracing that. So it's been around for so long, and I like it how we can then call it HSP and know what we're talking about. But I do think there could be definitely challenges with it.
Sure. Is there another term that you wish were used?
I've heard you use, I can't remember the exact phrase, but it has something to do with sensory.
Sensory processing sensitivity is the research term.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps something along the lines of that even is even more descriptive of what knowing that this is actually a trait in somebody.
Yeah, and it's not a disorder. It's not a diagnosis. It occurs in too many of the people for it to be a problem. It's just a trait that we're genetically born with. It's how we come wired. Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. Dara, can you talk a little bit about how you became interested in working with the transgender and non-binary community?
It's something where I would say it happened serendipitously. It's one of those things where I stumbled into what this ends up being one of my life purposes, is to help these individuals, but it did not start off like that at all. I'll kind of skip the beginning parts of the story about why is it that I ended up in graduate school to become a counselor. But basically, when I was around in my early 30s, I started graduate school. And when I finished, I was honestly, I remember being a little burned out. And I decided I wanted to just work somewhere else that wasn't counseling related at first. And so in Colorado Springs, we used to have a Pride Center here. At that point in time, I had already come out as being gay when I was 30 years old, and I wanted to get more involved with my local community. And so I ended up getting hired at the Pride Center and very quickly was promoted to associate executive director because we got a big grant. And so, but I do remember when I first started working there, in my interview, the executive director asked me what would be my biggest challenge working at a LGBT center. And I said, I have no experience when it comes to either working with or even personally knowing anybody who's transgender. And so that really was, I noticed that was a real big gap in my awareness. And so after I worked at the Pride Center for a couple of years, I definitely had some interaction with those who are transgender. And then as it happened, I was ready to then use my master's degree and decided to follow up with being a counselor. And so I ended up working at an agency and got some of my licensure hours there. But I immediately became known as somebody locally who was going to be a safe person to visit for those who are LGBT. In that case, where I work, where I live, is a fairly conservative area to the extent where it had, especially over 10 years ago, been difficult for people to find a therapist they could work with and feel safe with. So for those who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and then for those who are transgender, especially because it takes more expertise to work with those who are transgender. And so through that experience, I started getting just a whole lot of referrals from the community.
Can you explain to us what transgender and non-binary are for people that are not familiar?
Yeah, the easiest way I can get down to it, which, I mean, there are so many nuances and complexities, but basically when we are all born, and sometimes beforehand, because you can see this through an ultrasound, is there is an assumption made about what the gender of a baby is, and it's all based on external genitalia. When you are born and everybody sees what genitalia that you have, you are then told and assigned either male or female as your gender. And over the years, it has become more apparent that even though that may be the biological sex, that is not necessarily your gender identity. You get your sense of gender identity as you start to develop and become a child, and you start to notice there's a society around you that might be calling you a certain gender, and you might recognize that that doesn't feel comfortable to you. And so, in other words, somebody who does not feel aligned with their assigned gender at birth is potentially could be transgender. And this is where we get into some nuances, is where not everybody will call themselves transgender or trans. And then you've got those like myself who don't feel aligned with being either male or female. And at this point, the broadest category we call that is being non-binary. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm more familiar with the term transgender and what that what that entails. And what I've heard people say is, I feel like I was born into the wrong body. Like I'm in a male's body, but I really feel like I'm supposed to be a girl. Like I am a girl. That would be if I were going to water it down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that is definitely one of the ways that people who experience that have described their experience. And I think that that is probably the description that is most known mainstream wise. But beneath that, there are definitely people who they feel like that doesn't quite accurately describe their experience of what it feels like, because there can be all sorts of different ways that somebody feels uncomfortable with their body that may or may not align with in terms of the gender that they feel connected with. So again, that kind of goes that goes beyond the 101 and into like the 201 category. But yeah, not feeling like just there's your body is one of the aspects, but there's also the socialization. There's, you flat out could have the wrong hormones. You could have gone through the wrong puberty. And that's one of the most challenging aspects of the experience of being transgender.
I didn't track you, so can you say a little bit more about that? And can you just make up an example so that it's easier for me to follow?
Yeah, sure. I kind of hesitate to use myself because I am non-binary, and that's not necessarily the story that most people are even slightly familiar with. So I can use the example of, obviously I won't name names, but let's say I have a client who was assigned male at birth. And so that means that that person was born with male genitalia. So they go through their childhood, and a lot of times during childhood, depends on the person's upbringing. Let's say this is a person who had a fairly gender neutral household. Parents didn't really push either male or female onto them. Everybody thinks this is a boy, but they are able to kind of just do whatever they want. There's a real sort of period of being genderless for a while as a child. And then what usually changes that is puberty. So when puberty happens to this child, there are secondary sex characteristics that start to develop. And that is a lot of times for those who are transgender, that they start to recognize something's going wrong. Sometimes they describe it as feeling like their body is betraying them. They did not realize as they were growing up, maybe they had some clues. So in this case, this person actually is female in terms of their gender identity. They didn't realize as they were growing up that this was something that was happening. But once their body started developing in a way that didn't make sense to them, that's where a lot of the discomfort starts to come up. They notice boys and girls around them developing, and the boys are glad to be getting hairier and having deep voices and getting taller and muscular. And the girls, they're like, wow, I don't feel like that's what I want. And they're watching female friends develop, and they're like, that feels like what I should be going through. Why am I not going through that? And so that can be an excruciatingly painful time because, especially if you don't have information as to why it's happening, then that's going to be an experience of having your body change in ways that then make you really, really that assigned male gender at birth when it turns out your actual gender identity is female. So I'll pause just to check in to see so far if that makes sense.
Totally does. You're doing an amazing job. Thank you.
Okay. So as that person gets older, now I have people of all sorts of different ages. There's people who are going through this and they're in their 60s, but that's because the internet wasn't around when they were younger. In this case, let's say this is somebody who still did not have access to that kind of information to know what's happening to me. So they might come to me, in therapy. They could, let's say, even if they're in their 20s, it's already too late. Their bodies already went through male puberty, but it turns out because their gender identity is female, that means there's different things that in this person's case, they need to be able to look at and decide, should they start hormone therapy, which would then put them into female puberty. They would then be going through female puberty in their 20s, or like I said, I have clients doing this, even in their 60s. They would then develop certain female sex characteristics so that they can be more aligned with their true gender identity. And then you also have then perhaps having to change their name, and then changing legal documents involving their gender, changing it to female, asking people to use pronouns of female pronouns with them, and then externally, changing the way their gender expression is.
Got it. Thank you. That was very clear.
Great.
Can you explain a little bit more about how non-binary plays into this? And if you're comfortable using yourself as an example, great. And if not, I want to respect your sense of privacy and what you feel comfortable sharing.
Oh, yeah. I've found that it can be really useful to use my personal experience to caveat that my experience as a non-binary person isn't the same as all non-binary people. One of those things is where non-binary is something that I did not know existed as an option. Right now, I'm 44 years old. And I would say it was because of the work that I do and the people I work with. I probably first found out about 5 years ago that this existed as a possibility. One way I equate it is that I remember when I was younger that when I was really confused about my sexual orientation, because I definitely had attraction to females, I didn't learn until my early 20s there was even an option of bisexual. And I remember at that time, to me, I thought, oh, wait, that means I can still be married to this guy, but it's okay that I have attraction to women. And so I was able to say, that's a word and that's a term and that describes me. For me, it ended up piggybacking me into actually realizing that I was gay. And that's kind of what non-binary is. If I had known when I was younger that was something that people felt and experienced, I would have, when I was much younger, have known that was who I really was. But it's just not something that's been talked about until the last few years. So it did take me a while to recognize, because I thought I had already gone through all of my identity crisis stuff, like, oh no, it turns out, I have known this all along, but I actually am gay. And I thought that was it. And so it turns out about 10 years later, I realized there's another layer going on in which it's a little difficult to describe, but in simplest terms, it's kind of like after a while, I started realizing that when I was addressed as ma'am or ladies, when I had to choose between either a male or female restroom, like I just kept feeling uncomfortable. Something didn't feel right as me being perceived as a woman and as female. But I definitely did not feel like I was like my transgender male clients, that I actually was a guy. And so once I learned that there was something called non-binary that felt really right, and has, as over the last 4 years now, as I've been embracing that as my identity, it's made so much sense. The only bummer is that so much of society doesn't know that exists. So I'm very much perceived still as female, and then having to try to take the time to educate people that there's actually another option. It can be a little exhausting and a little trying, but that is definitely part of what, including being on this podcast, of part of what I'm doing.
Sure. So just for clarification, so if someone is non-binary, if I'm understanding you correctly, that they don't identify as either being male or female, am I hearing you right?
Yeah, exactly. And so, and again, the most simplified way is to kind of think of it as gender options being male, female, or non-binary.
Okay. And then I'm not sure how to divide this down to keep it simple. Let's go back to transgender for a second. So if someone is transgender, is it separate from who they are attracted to? So say somebody is born, and I'm so nervous about the language. We'll talk about this in a minute, but just correct me. So I'm hesitating because I just want to get it right. So
it's okay.
So this is the easiest way for me to say it. If this is disrespectful, please correct me, and I'll try and adjust my language.
I will. No worries.
Okay, so this is how we talk in our house. So someone is born with boy parts,
mm-hmm.
but they feel like I'm really a female at whatever point.
Right.
Is who they're attracted to, is that a separate factor from being transgender?
It sure is. Yes. And that's a great question, because that is something I even remember like I talked about back in the early days when I was still learning more about this myself. I remember in graduate school, I was doing a presentation about this topic, and that's one of the questions that came up. And I remember not knowing how to answer their question. And so it is something that comes up a lot. So yeah, sexual orientation is separate. And so let me think of, let's use the example of the person previously we were talking about. And so let's say as that person was growing up, so again, everybody assumes and thinks this is a boy. And then, so in this case, let's say this boy finds themselves attracted to, I'll take it a step up just to see if everybody can keep up. Let's say that they find themselves attracted to other boys. And so then they're like, oh no, like, am I gay? Like, let's say this is still an issue and I don't know if I can tell anybody and so as they, grow up, and then let's say they come to see me and they say, actually, I realize I'm female. So we address that part, so they are going to transition to female. They're starting female hormones. And so then we start talking about their attractions. And then they're like, well, ever since I was little, I was attracted to boys. And I thought maybe that meant I was a gay guy. But it turns out I'm a female. And so therefore, in this case, that person is actually heterosexual because they are actually female. Even if they are transgender female, they are female. And so therefore, if their sexual, they notice their sexual orientation maintains and stays the same, that means that as a woman, they are still attracted to men. So if you imagine it, a woman being attracted to a man, someone would say they're straight. So that's an example of how, even though it might seem like something else earlier on, once they get solid in knowing what their gender identity is, then they can look at that sexual orientation. And then you refer to it as who that person truly is in their gender identity.
Okay, so it sounds like gender identity, whether we identify as being male or female, regardless of the parts that we were born with, how we identify, that's one factor. And then a separate factor is sexual orientation, who we're attracted to, regardless of what our parts are.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay. Is that offensive when I just say parts?
Oh, well, let me say no. Just to me, it is not offensive. There's, like I said, there's a lot of sensitivity language and things like that. If you were going to be doing a presentation about this, then like you said, this is how you talk in your house. And, I was just using I just said male genitalia, but it's pretty much the same thing as you're saying. So there's all this discussion around, why do we even call it male genitalia and we call this female genitalia? And that's part of learning about using gender neutral language. For instance, if somebody transgender is going to see the doctor, let's talk about this example we had used. Let's say that person appears to everybody now because they've been through transition as a female, but they still haven't had surgery yet. They still have not had genital surgery. They're not going to want their doctor to refer to their genitalia as male genitalia. They would just use the proper medical terms. I know we can't curse on your show. I don't know if I could say penis. You can just use that instead, or ask the person, what are you comfortable with me referring to your genitalia as? Because you're obviously a woman. Your genitalia is still present from when you were born.
Gotcha. And this is probably a great place to go into talking about pronouns. So can you talk to us about pronouns? And we'll go into the conversation that you and I had about pronouns before you came on the show.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Just kind of jump in general regarding pronouns.
Yes. And then maybe specifically talk about your pronouns.
Sure. So pronouns is one of those things where it can sound like the most simple way to make sure that you are respecting somebody by getting them right, but it's also something that can take a lot of time to be able to practice that and get used to it, because I'm not a neuroscience person, but I know from my experience, those pronouns get really ingrained in the brain. It happens to me as well. And so this would mean that somebody who is transitioning, and again, if somebody says, I am, even though I was assigned male at birth and you saw me raised as a little boy and I went through male puberty, that there was a mistake. Like that was not supposed to happen. I am actually, my gender identity is female. And there's biological basis to that in terms of the brain is actually a female brain. And so they're going to say, could you stop using, I'd like for you to not use male pronouns for me anymore. Don't refer to me as he and him, using those pronouns. Use she and her. And so this is, let's say this conversation this person's having with their family and with their friends. And so this means that everybody in an ideal situation will start practicing that and making sure they use she and her whenever they talk about that person to somebody else, or when they're referring to that person in front of them. Making sure that even if they mess up, they pause and correct themselves and try again. That's a very nuanced conversation that everybody would have with each other, is how do we gently correct each other when something like this happens? And so just to kind of toss in, then therefore, if somebody is non-binary, now people who are non-binary, I don't mean to make this more confusing. Not everybody who's non-binary uses they and them, which are like third gender pronouns, as their pronouns. Some people are still okay using he or she. And some people are okay with you could use either he or she when you refer to me. It's all just like a personal preference of how it feels right and comfortable to them. And for myself, for a while, I thought I could be okay staying with she and her as my pronouns, even though I was non-binary. And mainly it was because I didn't want to have to make everybody change the way they were used to referring to me. Not to mention that I do also, it's taken me a lot of practice to get used to they and them as a pronoun, as a singular pronoun. And so I know a lot of people say that that's difficult. And it is. It was difficult for me too, but definitely with practice, it's become a lot easier. So just kind of to put a pin in it when it comes to everybody listening, if you know somebody who's transgender and they're asking you to honor what pronouns they're asking you to use, it's really important to do so, and also work with that person in terms of how can you remind me and let me know when I have messed up, and I want to be sure that I am aware of this. So, but also I don't want, it's hard because then you can feel kind of bad and stupid about it. And so being able to navigate this is important as well for the relationship.
Yeah. There are two things that popped in my mind, and I'm wondering if you have any information. I'm sure no research has been done. I'm curious if for those folks that are highly sensitive people, and I'm just going to talk this through, so just please gently correct me. Here's what I'm thinking.
Sure.
If somebody is a highly sensitive person and they're transgender, it would seem to me that it would be easier to ask somebody to use the pronouns that are in alignment with how you identify. If you're non-binary, I'm wondering if it would be harder because of that whole thing that highly sensitive people have around not wanting to make other people feel uncomfortable. And often we put others' needs in front of ours, yet how we're named is so important to our identity. And so I'm wondering if that's a layer that would make it more challenging. Kind of like you said, I really tried to go by female pronouns and it just didn't work for me. And so then it means having to ask people to change how they identify me. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that was actually really perceptive of you, because you kind of took it to, you picked up on what could possibly be something that's even challenging for non-binary people, even compared to those who are transgender. And I just want to mention for sure that those who are highly sensitive and more on the binary of being transgender, it still can be really challenging, especially in public, being addressed as ma'am or sir, and having to pause and say, actually, no, it's ma'am. For a highly sensitive person, that could be all your energy for the whole day, have to done that. But you're right, being non-binary, the challenge is that not only am I asking people to use a different pronoun for me and not to refer to me as ma'am, but I also don't want them to then use the opposite word. I also don't want you to call me sir. And I also, no, I don't want you to call me he. There's this other thing, and it's called non-binary, and it's my pronouns are they, them. And then I know that that's not something that a lot of people are aware of. And so as a highly sensitive person, I do get very caught up in how can I be sure that I'm being experienced as who I really am, but also by not then creating a very uncomfortable an awkward situation? And the answer is that that's not really possible. I've had to get over that and know that I am probably accurately picking up on awkwardness and discomfort when I have this conversation. It could be I'm having it with somebody who's a server at a restaurant. It could be I'm having it with my mom. It's across the spectrum where this can be on a daily basis, trying to decide do I have it in me today to try to explain to somebody what it means to be non-binary, and therefore here's how I'm asking you to change your language.
Yeah. I'm just making notes. My head is just swimming. There's so many things that are going on. So I'm trying to take notes as we're talking. So a few things. To the listeners, if you're non-binary and you've had experiences where it's been harder because you're a highly sensitive person, if any of this stuff that we're talking about, you want to reach out to me, like, I'm so curious about things like this. So if you want to shoot me an email and tell me about your experience, if it's been harder because you're a highly sensitive person, if you want to share, I'm really curious. You can reach out to me at unapologeticallysensitive@gmail.com. Please let me know if you want to remain anonymous or if you're comfortable with me using your story. I'm not even sure if anybody will even respond, but I want to be really, really respectful of people's privacy and confidentiality. And, I really never know how I'm going to use information that comes in. So please understand that I just want to learn. And then my other question to you is, Dara, you and I had, again, I'm not getting any money from Marco Polo, really need to get some paid sponsorship from them. But you and I had poloed because I knew that you used the pronouns they, them. And I poloed you and was just so anxious because I wanted to say your name. Is it Dara or is it Dara? And wanted to get pronouns right and couldn't imagine that really pronouns would come up in a conversation with you. My one question is, so how was it, like you said, it's kind of hard, you having to deal with other people's energy. How was it for you with me saying, like, I really want to get it right, and if I get it wrong, please correct me. But how was it for you dealing with that energy with me?
Oh, and I want to be sure I mention that your approach to it, I think, was extremely compassionate, because I could tell that, when it comes down to it, you wanted to be sure that if at all possible, you could get that right because you are sensitive and I'm sensitive. And it was so important to you. For me, that's what my first impression is, what I gather from somebody is like, wow, they really are trying. They really want to make sure that I feel respected and seen and experienced as who I am. So, and again, maybe that is because I'm highly sensitive. That is what emotes to me first and foremost. So once I have, and I can feel that, then it's easy to be able to then engage in a conversation about that. I've heard so many other people, especially other therapists that I've talked to who I'm trying to train to work with this population, say the exact same things that you have said. So for me, I want to be sure that I'm able to teach others about this in such a way that takes into account the nervousness, the anxiousness that can come up. And I know that I feel the same way when there's, let's say, a different marginalized group that I want to be sure I'm being respectful towards and not being sure, am I using the right terms and language? And so I know what it feels like to me if somebody is compassionately engaging with me regarding that. So I wanted to be able to be sure to return that as well. So, and I think it led to some really cool conversations that you and I ended up having.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and one of the things that I said was, if it's not okay to talk about, I don't know what we're going to do because I need to learn. And the only way I'm going to learn is by practicing and making mistakes. So if I make a mistake, please just gently correct me. And then I don't think I heard from you for a day or two. And it's like when you start dating someone, it's like, oh my gosh, did I offend you? Should I send another polo? And I just sat with the discomfort, but I definitely had that. I didn't hear from you for, I don't know, a day or two. And I thought like, oh my gosh, like, how are you taking this? Because I felt really vulnerable and exposed, but the way that I navigate through life is if I'm feeling nervous or uncomfortable, I need to name it, and then we deal with it. And if it doesn't work for you to deal with that, then I don't think it's going to work for us to have a conversation.
Right. Oh, that's so funny. I mean, I'm sorry I didn't respond sooner. And I'm sure it's one of those things where I do that all the time to people where we'll be like engaging and then I'm like, oh gosh, I haven't like had a moment to myself today to like record this polo. And then like 2 days pass by and then it's like as if time hasn't passed on my side. But when I'm on the other side of it, you bet I do the exact same thing you do.
I've gotten pretty good distress tolerance. And I just know that when I'm vulnerable, especially with someone new, I don't know how it's going to be received. And it was fine. I lived to tell about it. So we're all good.
Oh, good. Yeah. And I think that's something too, is that because you were talking about that on your side, and then I would share some things with you, like that I was personally struggling with. Like, for instance, I sent you like a video like at 11 at night. It was probably like the strangest timing because that was probably like the next one you got from me, where I'm like, I don't know if I'm an introvert or extrovert. Your last podcast episode like blew my mind, and and so we didn't talk about gender or anything. Like, I just needed to like share that with you. And so you were so kind in your response and just kind of like helping me navigate that a bit. And so I think that's what happens, is that you and I now forming, a friendship, and we're able to then be able to have these kind of conversations, even though they may still be awkward. But I think you took a chance in being vulnerable with me about it. And so I think then, I kind of like tennis, like I kind of hit vulnerability back to you again. Here's mine. And I feel like that's then, it really creates that space where you can be able to talk safely about it.
Right. And I really think that vulnerability and courage really go hand in hand. And last week's episode with Christina Miglino, she talks about the reason why she's willing to risk and be vulnerable is because it's all about that sense of connection. And that's exactly what you and I experience with not really having face-to-face communication, but using the polos in between, and me being willing to be vulnerable opened up a place for you to be vulnerable and for me to be able to step in and have a sense of connection. I think that's really the gift of when we're willing to allow others to see us in our imperfection when we're struggling, as long as they're safe people. There's just this beautiful connection that can happen.
Yeah. And I think that maybe that's something, in terms of us modeling that your listeners, and, it's whether they're a therapist or a teacher or whatever they are engaging in, either in their profession or even in their personal life, you're going to either already know or at some point will know somebody who's transgender or non-binary. And so just remembering that if this is someone you're going to maybe interact with on a regular basis, either as a client or your kid has a friend, the key is to like make it more than just about their gender and you wanting to get it right. Like, form communication with each other so that you can then be able to move through those types of conversations with more ease.
Right. Can you talk about why I would not say Dara's preferred pronouns are they, them, their? Can you say how the correct way of saying that and why it's not okay to say preferred?
I'm just chuckling because it was only, I would say, a few months ago that I learned that you're not supposed to say preferred pronouns anymore. And, I pay attention to this kind of stuff. And so I was like, oh no, I didn't realize. I think I went to a conference and I learned that. So once I sort of digested what does the word prefer mean, I guess it's insinuating that I would I would prefer you use Dara and they, them as my pronoun. It still isn't quite strong enough. It's kind of giving permission of like, that's what I prefer, but if you want to use something else, that's fine with me. I think that's what the inference is. And so therefore there's a need to change the language so that it's really known. Sometimes the word chosen is used. So you would say, I was wondering, what are your chosen pronouns? Or you could just say, what are your pronouns? And so that's what the vernacular is starting to move more towards.
It didn't occur to me until we were talking about this. And I want to be really, really respectful here. So you were on somebody's podcast where you had a very similar conversation to what we're talking about. And then when the guest did the introduction, they used she and her pronouns to talk about you. In this social media group, there was a discussion about it. And it was in this thread about your podcast interview where I was talking about, have you listened to the podcast, How to Be a Girl by Marlo Mack?
I have listened to it a couple times.
I am in love with that podcast. What do you think?
Oh, nice. It's been a while since I didn't even know it was still around because I remember discovering it a few years ago. So thank you for the reminder. I definitely need to tune back in.
I will put this in the show notes. It's a story of, and I was sharing about this in this thread. And when I was explaining that, okay, so this is going to be the test for me. And I'm going to try and use appropriate language without saying parts. So I'm so bloody nervous. So the story is about a child who was born with male genitalia. And at age 3, she knew that she was a girl. The mom supports this. And so the podcast is the mom using lots of clips of her daughter and the experience that they're going through as this daughter grows up. And I think at about now on the podcast, the daughter is maybe in 5th grade. And so I was sharing about this podcast in the thread that came up about the podcast that you were on. And I was trying to, what I think I said was, whatever it was, I used preferred pronouns trying to indicate that the child was born with male genitalia and then identifies as a female. And that's where somebody said, you don't use preferred. And the only reason why I bring this up is this is such a highly sensitive person thing that I can remember the one time that I used it, I was corrected, I was wrong, and I don't want to get it wrong again. Like that's what happens with us as highly sensitive people, that all it takes is one time. And then we kind of are on high alert, not wanting to make that same mistake again. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yep. I totally can relate. Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that because that's, and it's interesting because when you were talking about the podcast, because you wanted to have the person who did the podcast be sort of anonymous, so you didn't want to gender them. So you said you used they, like in the sentence to describe the person. So again, it's a good example of how there's many different instances where we use singular they in a sentence. If we don't know the gender of somebody or we don't want to say the gender of someone, we'll say they. But that was definitely a good example of that. Yeah, I want to give an example of this, of how I have done this before. I had on Facebook and so I'm now like, oh, this was like so embarrassing that I did this, but this was a few years ago. And I said something about someone who had passed away who was African American. And I said, I just feel horrified saying this, but I said, rest in peace, girl. It's just one of those things that just came out of my mouth and I typed it in and I said it. And there was somebody locally who pointed out to me through Messenger, like, especially for her, she's African American, and how offensive that is to her. And she was actually having a friend who was just like refusing not to stop using that with her. And because it was really triggering and minimizing. And like you said, that one time it happened. And now I tell everybody else not to do it. And I researched it and I just wanted to make sure that didn't happen again. But same thing can happen for sure when it comes to using language, when it comes to being transgender and non-binary. And so, yeah, I think just being able to, you never know who's going to correct you, I guess is what I'm saying. You said in that instance, I'm not sure who said it or how they said it, but there's different ways it can be approached, but everybody's different and they're going to have their different approaches. And so it can be hard if it's maybe a more feels corrective in that sense. It can make a person shy and then say, maybe this is too difficult to engage with this population or to talk about this population because I don't want to get in trouble again. And so I really try to keep that in mind when I'm educating people, because it's so important to me that people are able to make those mistakes and then, gently be pointed out, because that's the only way we're going to learn.
Sure. All right. I'm a little focused on the saying, you rest in peace, girl. Here's what I'm thinking is it because the person was African American and going back to slavery when men and women were referred to as boys and girls and really lost their status as human beings?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And actually, when I talk to more people about it, it is in general just even referring to women as girls
or ladies.
Yeah, exactly. There's definitely, and like we talked about before the interview, there's over time, there's different things we've been used to saying. And even if we're like, oh my gosh, that's a good point, I want to change my language. But then even though we know it's the right thing to do. It even takes a while to get the brain then to start reprocessing that and using different words.
Yeah, what we had talked about before we started recording is I feel like I'm really meticulous with language. Language is so important to me. And around talking about transgender and non-binary, my brain has to work so hard. And I can even see how for the ease of my mind using girl parts and boy parts. I mean, that's something that I use just in general because it's easy and it's kind of humorous. My little gremlins are going off, so that's what the pause was about.
I know when your gremlins come up, right? For when I've heard your other episodes.
I can just see how that it's almost paralysis because like I just want to get it right. And my brain is just like chugging so hard I have notes in front of me. So when I want to say something, like I look down at my notes to grab new vocabulary that's just not as familiar to me. And it's because I want to be respectful.
Right. Well, here's a little tip, because I heard when you were describing the child who is being talked about in that podcast. So the phrase saying this child was assigned male at birth, it gives that you can infer, therefore, that child was born, like you said, with, male genitalia or male parts. But if you're like, all right, I don't want to refer to the genitalia in this situation because you're talking about it in a certain circumstance. So if you say they were assigned male at birth, that's a different way of saying it.
Wait, tell me what the distinction between the two was, because I used genitalia in the first and not at the second. Is that the difference?
Oh, no. Well, to me, it sounds like when you use genitalia and parts, like that's in the same category. In both instances, we are specifically focusing on these body parts. But it's a way to sort of take a step back and not even have to refer to genitalia at all. You're talking about that person, that child's experience in which they were assigned male at birth, which then can encompass everything about what it means. And I don't know about this kid, but were they then dressed in blue and encouraged to try to play sports and whatever the gender stereotypes are. But that way it encompasses the full picture.
I just had kind of a big aha moment. I think that that's just another way that I kind of kept a pretty limited view. And it is about how we identify and how we feel. And it's way more than parts.
Excellent.
Thank you for sharing that.
Sure. That was fun. I like aha moments.
Yeah. I'm looking at the time and kind of wondering where we want to go from here. Are there more things around this that we haven't discussed that you want to discuss?
I think we've covered some really good ground. One thing I'll mention briefly because it's on my mind. Because I made a video that I put on Facebook this morning, and I talked about I called it marginalized fatigue. So basically it's something like you're in a marginalized group. For instance, even you yourself as a woman, and there maybe are other marginalized groups you're a part of, but I was just feeling fatigued as a non-binary person or even a trans person because I'm trying to get my gender marker changed on my driver's license. In Colorado, you can now have the option of not having to put, in my case, female. I can have an X put on it, which in my case means I'm non-binary. You don't have to have male or female on it. But I've been having some issues getting it changed because I had to have a form signed by my doctor. And it turns out the doctor used a stamp. And the first time I went to the office, they said the signature was not valid because it was a stamp. And then I contacted advocacy group, and advocacy group said that's not true. The DMV said it's fine. So anyway, this week I was going to go back to the DMV with this form, and I called up. So this is me being a highly sensitive person. I'm like, I want to make sure this is like all my ducks are in a row. I do not want to go through the experience of going to the DMV and then being turned away. Like that knocked me out for like the entire day just to have that happen. And so I was like, oh, I don't really have the energy to go through that again. And so I tried to talk to the DMV, and they were being questionable again. I left the message with the regional manager. And after I did that, was that Thursday morning, I was like, you know what? I had an appointment for Friday to go to the DMV. I was like, I'm just going to cancel it. That was really fatiguing just to even go through those 2 phone calls of trying to make sure that this is going to go well this time. And for them to say, no, it's still possible you might have your form rejected. I decided to self-care and reschedule the appointment for a different day so that I wouldn't have to go through that. So I think what I'm talking about here is, in my case, this is specifically either a non-binary or a trans fatigue that I can experience. But for, everybody listening, think about all the different, perhaps the different marginalized groups you are a part of, and being a highly sensitive person and how challenging that can be sometimes to go through your day. And there might be microaggressions that happen against you that you let them pass, or sometimes you're not sure if you should say something. And then recognize that's a lot of hard work, and you might not even know it's been happening to you. So because it just happened this morning, and I welcome your listeners to friend me on Facebook, because that's my favorite place to actually connect and meet new people. You can see the video there where I talk more about that.
Okay, so if they want to friend you, it's Dara Hoffman-Fox on Facebook, and then they can find the video. Was it a live that you did?
I actually ended up recording it and uploading it.
Okay. Is it on your YouTube channel?
I was thinking, I realized just a bit ago that I could probably upload it there. So I will do that as well. Yes.
Why don't you send me a link to your YouTube channel, and I will put that in the show notes.
That'd be great.
Dara, I'm looking at the time, and we're running close to the end of a full episode. So what I'd like to do is to end this episode, and then we'll do a shorter bonus episode with the time that you've got free to finish up this episode.
That'd be great.
Thank you so much for being here today and for joining me. I really appreciate it.
This has been great, Patricia. Thank you for letting me be on your show.
Oh, thanks, Dara. Have a great day. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. If you're enjoying this podcast, please rate and review. It makes the podcast easier for others to find. You can rate it on your iPhone in the podcast app, or you can go to unapologeticallysensitive.com and click on one of the more recent episodes, and there are instructions and links in the show notes so you can rate this podcast. If you have questions or comments, I love hearing from you. Please reach out to me at unapologeticallysensitive@gmail.com. We have a closed Facebook group called Unapologetically Sensitive, where we're building a great community. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.